Hello and welcome to the Federal. This is our inaugural episode of our new program, Off the Beaten Track. In this program, we are going to not talk about what are the dominating headlines of the moment, but something which is there all the time in our conversational background, but really does not get into the conversation per se because of our preoccupation with the headlines. So we are going to be taking some time off the headline and going back and look at issues as to what leads to the creations of the headlines. My first episode is going to be on Muslims, Islam, and Islamicate in Bollywood or Bombay cinema. And my guest today is going to be Professor Ira Bhaskar of the School of Arts and Aesthetics of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has a very distinguished and accomplished academic career in which she has written a lot and studied about English literature, but she's also known as one of the most noted film scholars of the country. Her passions in terms of academic research has involved film and historical trauma, memory, violence, in the context of cinema, memory, violence, and representation, how it all is represented in cinema. Films on partition and contemporary communalism, something that has actually, dominated Indian politics in the political space for the last 3.5, 4 decades. And then she has worked extensively on cinema and what we call, or what rather she terms it, we will actually get to hear from her, Islamicate cultures. Now, I'll start off, Professor Bhaskar, a little bit before, on a personal note. I grew up in a small North Indian town, very much a Bengali, but growing up in Uttar Pradesh, in a town which was a kind of a microcosm of India, in the sense that there was a university campus where I lived, there was an army cantonment, there was a CSIR laboratory and its residential colonies, and there was a city where there were people of all diverse castes and communities and religious backgrounds. And this is also the part of Western UP, so there is a tremendous amount of Dargah culture. My parents were also culturally very active. So the Islamicate culture that you talk about, even though the fact that I am not a Muslim, very much a Hindu, but there is a certain amount of an Islamicate culture within me, and that came primarily through the Dargahs to which we went to, and to the Qawwalis, which my parents would sing in their annual day functions of the clubs, either the women's own club or the university, staff club. And so Qawwalis and Dargahs, it really seemed, and also the Muslims who were living with us, going around in Eid. So there was a perfect mix of what I was in terms of our own identities, social identities, the others that we intermingled with, and what was there in the air. So what I was talking about saying is that our topic is Muslims, Islam, and Islamicate in Bollywood or Bombay cinema. Now, I know that you have written extensively on Indian cinema, especially Bombay cinema, and you have, broken them into subgenres of the Muslim historical, Muslim courtesan films, and also the only recognized form, which is the Muslim social film. There's also, various scholars have also written, that there are 3 elements which goes into creating this genre of, Islam, Islamicate, and Muslim and cinema. We have to look at it in terms of language, basically poetry. We have to look at it in terms of the characters. Most common characters that you introduce a Nawab. Nawab has to be a Muslim. And then finally, you have the Tawaif Mujra, synergy, so you have a dancing girl. That is how it comes in. Now, when we talk about Bombay cinema and the fact that, we have a very large population of Muslims in the country and, the viewership of the Hindi cinema, how does the Muslims of India, their culture, and those who, despite not being Muslims, are influenced by the Islamicate culture? How is it represented? And what are the major issues that you see that you would like to talk about?
Thank you very much, Nilanjan. Thank you also the Federal for this program. The question you've asked me is a very large question,
Yes.
and it's a question that requires some sort of detailed answer. But let me begin by saying that I loved your story about your growing up years in a Western UK town. And that is what you describe as a common experience. It's actually a common experience because we have all, our generation, and even the young people today, they've all grown up living in India where temples and mosques and dargahs and churches, etc., are part of our everyday landscape, isn't it?
True.
We have also, and this is something that's quite distinctive, we have also grown up listening to ghazals and qawwalis, singing them, and attending festivals where qawwali, participating in Antakshari competitions where we sing these forms, and attending music festivals in which qawwalis are performed, and so on. And some of these forms are our favorite song genres. The ghazals and qawwalis are forms that we are all very fond of. And if you were to ask a young person about a qawwali, that young person would be able to speak quite a lot about the qawwali, because the qawwali is a very dominant form even today, despite all the animosity against Muslims and all of that. People, whether thinkingly or unthinkingly, love the qawwali. The ghazal, they may not even be very aware that the songs they like of Bombay films are ghazals. Some of them are ghazals. Right. They may not be aware of it, but there are some favorite songs as well. And of course, there are many qawwalis which are quite recognizable because of the way they are performed, right? So we have all grown up, and you're absolutely right in saying that these forms, the Islamicate forms, and we have defined the Islamicate. Richard and I wrote our first book, which was published in 2009, and that was called the Islamicate Cultures of Bombay Cinema. In that, we have used Marshall Hodgson's definition of the Islamicate as aesthetic and cultural forms that may have had their origin in Muslim societies outside of South Asia, but they are present today not only in Muslim contexts. In fact, one of the most well-known sort of Islamicate films, if you like, with not in terms of genre, but in terms of elements and tropes, is Sahib, Bibi or Ghulam, which is actually about a Bengali zamindar, decaying zamindari family, right? It actually maps very beautifully the death of the feudal aristocracy in Bengal and in other parts of India. And the tropes are all Islamicate over there, whether it's the mujra, whether it is ghazals, whether it is, it doesn't have a qawwali, but it certainly has mujras and ghazals.
I think it's a very perfect example that you have given to say that what is really Islamicate. It is not Islam. It is very much set in Bengal about the decaying feudal order. Yet it is very much, you have a look at it and you immediately have a sense that there is an Islamic link, and Bengal has had Islamic links. There is a certain history of Islam in Bengal.
Exactly. So whether it is the architecture, whether it is the fountains, whether it is, songs and performance and the way people speak and, a lot of that.
Mannerisms.
Mannerisms and everything. So obviously the zamindars are also cast in the same mold as Nawabs of North India. And they behave like that, they dress like that and so on. So anyway, that is, so what I'm trying to say, just as you have pointed out, that this is a constitutive element of Indian identity, especially in North India. And we need to understand and accept that this is constitutive of us in ways that we may not be very conscious of, that we may not always, and it's not just the what we like, not the songs that we like, the clothes we wear, because of course we wear the clothes. We wear salwar kameezes and shararas and gararas and all kind and churidars and these are so the dress codes, the costumes, etc. Right? But not only that, it is also our language. We must understand that the bol chal ki language, that is the language that we speak on an everyday basis, is Hindustani. And Hindustani's other name is Urdu, actually. It's just that for political reasons, Urdu has developed now in Pakistan and even in India with more Arabic and more Persian words. rather
Right.
than, whereas, and of course, Hindi has developed out, Khadi Boli Hindi has developed
Right.
more towards Sanskrit, but actually, during the 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up
Sure.
to the 70s, Hindustani is the language we speak. And the other name of Hindustani is Urdu, actually.
Now, in cinema, how does this all get reflected? We know that Indian cinema, especially the Bombay cinema, has evolved from the tradition of Parsi theatre.
Correct.
It came in essentially from that, and the early hits and the popular were very, Islamic stories, Shireen Farhad, Laila Majnu. You also had these historical things about the medieval era Muslim emperors, who has been the Muslim emperor, has been a very standard stereotyped character of a so-called Muslim film, or a film, which represents Muslims. So how that has it been portrayed? And as a person who has just watched films and written a bit about it, gets this feeling that there has always been a certain amount of stereotyping. I can actually start listing out, the kind of standard Muslim characters that you will find in a Hindi or a Bombay film.
Right.
So how is it?
So first of all, you're absolutely right. Bombay cinema evolved from the Parsi stage, and the language of the Parsi stage was Urdu. We need to remember that.
That's right.
And there were very historic reasons why Urdu was selected and not Gujarati, because the entrepreneurs who were behind the Parsi theatre were all mostly Gujaratis, Gujarati-speaking Parsis, right? But they did not choose
their language.
They didn't choose Gujarati. They opted for Urdu. And the reason for that is because Urdu has a wide reach and is spoken all over north of India. In those days, in the 19th century.
So they wanted to ramp it up nationally, basically.
Yeah, I mean, they knew that because Parsi theatre was a traveling theatre, they would perform different kinds of plays, and they needed a language that would communicate. And I won't go into the history of Urdu and how Urdu is a South Asian language and so on. But coming to your other question, how were Muslims represented? I think that in the silent period, and if you look at, you've mentioned certain titles, Khuni Khanjar, things like that. Zanjeer, Jahangir's, famous Zanjeer of justice, the chain of justice, those kinds of, and the Laila Majnus and the Shireen Farhads and all of those, the romances that were immortalized in different Masnavi poems, from the 11th century onwards. This is the inheritance of the literary inheritance, the popular inheritance that went into the making of of Bombay cinema from the silent period onwards. Now, obviously, if you're telling a story of Shireen Farhad and Laila Majnu or Jahangir or Mumtaz Mahal or Shah Jahan, you're dealing with characters who are Muslim. Right? And you're dealing with emperors and so on. So what I want to say is that from the silent period, you have the Muslims represented, in the silent period particularly, Muslims represented in genres like the historicals, the romances, the costume films or the fantasies, because the Islamicate imagination was the dominant imagination of the Parsi stage and of the early Bombay cinema as well. Okay. Now, it is in this context that the Hindu mythological films like
also get
made. And by the 1920s, we have the emergence of what we call the social form. And the social as a genre were contemporary films that dealt not with mythology or historical subjects or historical figures, but dealt with contemporary life. And contemporary life, usually urban life. So you had, the characters of these socials were, professional men and women, a lot of women. I mean, also, for instance, Sulochana is very well known for a film called Typist, the Typist Girl, things like that. So women who were working in the city and through whom and their lives and their marriages and their love affairs, contemporary social life was being depicted. But that social in the initial years was dominantly Hindu. They dealt with Hindu characters. In 1941, whereas the historicals were, of course, dominantly Muslim characters. characters. Not
Right.
exclusively so, but there were these sultans, the emperors, and the Mughal emperors, and the Sultanate
Right.
characters drawn from the Sultanate period, etc. Now, we've written about how in the pre-independence period, the historical performed an ideological role. It had an anti-colonial agenda. And
Right.
because the agenda was to prove that India was capable of self-governance. And the examples,
Right.
the best examples were drawn from the past, not obviously the colonial past, but the past before that, which was the Mughal and the Sultanate past, which, let's not forget that Islam has a 1,000-year history in our country.
True,
right?
true.
So they represented ideals of justice, law, governance, and these were being debated in the cinema of the early sound period. So genres like the historicals actually had a dominance, had a lot of Muslim characters, but the social, until 1941, did not have so many Muslim characters. And in 1941, a group of filmmakers approached K. Abbas and said that the Hindus make these socials about, and we are always cast as people, taken up, obsessed with the past, and we need to enter modernity, and we must have a Muslim social. And he got very angry with them.
And that is how the Muslim social genre got created.
Yeah, but he didn't want to make any of those. He said this is rubbish. He was a leftist. He was a secularist. He believed that India was
that is how the genre was created. Now let us try to do a quick, fast forward, to use the language of cinema and of the audio world, fast forward into India becoming an imperfect republic with a lot of tensions, partition happening, the trauma of partition lingering on, developing in the 70s into newer kind of problems. One level, you have the trauma of partition, which initial years does not get tackled much in the cinema. It finally gets a voice, at least it gets to be seen in a film like 1973, M.S. Satyu's Garam Hawa, for instance. So there is always this eternal question, which I keep on raising in my mind, that if Satyu had to make Garam Hawa in today's India, would Salim Mirza return to his home and get down from the Tanga and join the striking masses as it did in 73? So there is a certain amount of an impossibility. There has also been a certain difference in the kind of portrayal of the Muslim through that particular trauma. This entire almost 50 years of political trauma and marginalization of India's religious minorities, and the emergence of this narrative that this is our country and they are here at our, they should live here at our terms, that our and theirs has come into it. How has this kind of got reflected in cinema? Especially we have had, terrorism as a theme, partition as a theme. How does it get reflected?
Two very quick points here. One, that, trauma studies makes a very important point, which is that historical trauma, individual trauma is repressed and returns after a long time.
Time and again,
right? It returns again and again, but for a long time it's repressed. So partition, as there are very few films that dealt with the partition. If you look at 1947 to 1973, you can actually count the number.
Actually count on fingers, yes.
Yeah, there are 14 or 15 films, some of them deal directly with the partition moment, and others, wonderful film like 1961's Dharamputra, that is actually about.
There are,
there are some films like that.
Yes.
But it is largely an area that filmmakers did not want to touch out of the fear that, wounds would,
open up.
Again, open up. Yes. And it was the Indian New Wave, a movement of realistic cinema that began in 1969 with small films.
Which
a part of that moment that actually addressed the silences of history, the repressed histories of the subcontinent, and also the violence that people didn't want to confront. So this violence was was along the lines of course, communal violence and the history of partition that was repressed, but also gender violence and caste violence. So these were dominant themes that the Indian New Wave took up. And therefore, films like Garm Hawa and then TV series Tamas, and then
Thomas.
Tamas, and then Salim Langre Pe Matro, which is about contemporary communalism. Both Salim
Even
Langre
Bunyad,
and Bunyad on
had a
television.
had a shadow
Yes,
of
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So, but it took time. It took time before this could be. And one of the key moments and the reasons why partition became subject of scrutiny and of articulation was because of the 1984 Sikh violence.
That's right.
And
Exactly.
Sikhs, because the Sikhs at least, it seemed like the partition was not over. They had thought they had come home, but they had not come. And in 1984, after the violence and all the work that began to be done in 84, partition suddenly emerged like a major theme.
Right.
And that is when, you know, the Indian New Wave was and the riots like Bhiwandi riots of 71, the Bhiwandi riots of 84, these brought back the memories of partition violence. And the New Wave filmmakers began to make these films. In the context of the present, I just want to say that, again, two factors. One is the demolition of Babri Masjid.
That's right.
1992
1992. Yeah.
It's almost as if the demolition suddenly blows the lid off a simmering cauldron of communal conflict and hostility between between Muslims and Hindus in India. And the themes of the New Wave, which were art films and smaller films, suddenly begin to get addressed by the mainstream commercial cinema.
Yes, exactly.
So in 1995, you have a film like Bombay.
You have Bombay, you have Zakham.
Bombay, Zakham, Fiza, Heram, you have a whole bunch of films.
Yes.
So from the 90s, and I mark that the reasons for that as the demolition of Babri Masjid and the riots that took place in Bombay.
You're absolutely correct.
In other parts of the country. So since then, and let us also remember that the 80s, mid-80s, 85 onwards, the launch of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement has also begun.
Exactly.
Right? So these are things that culminates in 92 with the demolition, but that kind of the movement and the demolition suddenly brings to the surface all the anger and conflict and hostility.
A new mythology also, I would say, because, I would just interrupt, also point out, that in recent years, there has also been this increasing trend to make history films from a so-called correct perspective, which is villainization of the Muslim emperors. We have had Padmavat, which was definitely very difficult to make out that the filmmaker made several very sensitive films earlier on.
Yes.
So you've had
even Bajirao Mastani just 2 years before that. Bajirao Mastani is a very different film from Padmavat. And it is a love story.
And I know that you have written and spoken extensively about Jodha Akbar, which you consider to be actually representative of what the ideal Indian should be. But I know that this medium that we are actually interacting on is extremely frustrating in terms of really being bound by a very time constraint. We can actually continue a discussion like this for endless hours, but there are certain limitations. Now, when we talk about the particular moment, what we are seeing a certain amount of negative portrayal of the Muslim, either through the historical film genre or something, even in contemporary cinema, like terrorism is very much a reality in India, but it gets represented. There have been films with terrorism as a theme, as a narrative, but we are finding it very increasingly difficult to actually have the true and a correct perspective through these cinemas. Would you agree?
I agree, but I also want to point out that terrorism and communalism are two different things. They tend to be connected by dominant discourses, political discourses, especially today. But films, cross-border terrorism has been a reality in India for a long, long time.
Right.
And from 1992 onwards, because of the Kashmir incident and the expulsion of Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir, the question of cross-border terrorism has been
very yes,
right?
Yes,
and that's one thing. But the films about communalism in the past. So when you say that today we are looking at the demonization of the Muslim figure, both in the social films as well as in the historical films, etc., this is a very new trend. From the late 80s onwards, it's true that we had begun to see more and more figures of Muslims like who were terrorists and so on.
Right.
But there was a concern. A lot of that had to do with the question of terrorism, cross-border terrorism. So a film like Sarfarosh, you will see the evil Muslim, but the evil Muslim is Pakistani.
Right.
The evil Muslim is not the Indian Muslim, you know. Though, of course, in Roja, I mean, scholars have made
Roja is a very important film.
The scholars have made the argument that when you show the Muslim as a terrorist, there's a tendency to see all Muslims as terrorists. At the same time, the films before 2016, the historical films, did not actually demonize the Muslim.
So after 2016, you think that there is a greater amount of demonization of the Muslim in Bombay cinema?
Absolutely.
Do you think so?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that especially in the historical genre, where all Muslim emperors are seen as rapacious, barbaric, exploitative, extremely violent, destroying Hindu culture and all of that. And there has been an attempt at glorification of Hindu kings and so on, right? So that has been there. There has also been a fight back. I won't say that, and the fight back has been in this fight back. When I say fight back, I mean different perspectives. These are in films that are smaller films, films, indie films, in which the focus has been on actually portraying what the Muslim goes through in contemporary India today, the kind of oppression. So a film like Mulk, for instance, in which of course the lawyer is fighting for the Muslim as an integral part of India. But
we also had this film called Shahid, I think.
Shahid, I was just going to mention Shahid, and a very beautiful film called Nakash, which is a very moving film set in Banaras. And it's very important for me to point out that, in the context of the Gyanvapi Mosque controversy today and so on, what is really happening here is that Banaras is being claimed by Hindutva as essentially a Hindu city, when it is equally.
Whereas it is not. It is equally. It has. How can we forget Bismillah Khan? Playing the Shehnai in the gullies of Kashi Vishwanath Mandir, or Kabir arising from there.
And so on. So the story of Nakash actually demonstrates this struggle, because the Nakashis who were working in the Hindu temples on the banks of the Ganga were generally Muslim craftsmen. And it is these and their art that has produced the beauty of Banaras, for which they are paying now, and they're being alienated, killed, etc. It's a very lovely film, small film making a very big point about Banaras.
So I think basically what you're saying, that yes, there is political pressure. Yes, the political classes, the ruling classes of the times would actually like their Kashmir Files type of films being made, yet there is a certain pushback, and I think the attempts at the pushback needs to be applauded, and also appreciated. Absolutely. And this is where scholars like you have a very vital role to keep on showing them the light by saying that who understand history, politics, as well as cinema, and this is where people like you have a very important role in the coming years. Thank you very much, Professor Ira Bhaskar, for having come to the inaugural program of what we call Off the Beaten Track. So I think we have stepped aside, but really not away from what is happening in the country. Thank you very much.
Most pressing issues of today, actually.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Thank you.